Let's go on to the fragments of evidence. When we deal with the fragments of evidence, we're dealing with the fraction of the evidence that we have all the way through the whole process of location, identification, interpretation, and publication. And we're looking at the evidence. We find out that the evidence we have is indeed fragmentary. That it is amazing that we have as much as we do that deals with Scripture. I don't know about you, but if you go into your house at home, how much can you locate? How many items can you locate that come from the time of your childhood, from the time you were an infant to, say, 6 or 7 years of age? How many objects can you find in your home today that are from that period of time? How much survives? And you can just check that in your own life. That which we currently have is dominated normally by the things we use now. And as we go through a period of time, things that we had before get discarded, get destroyed, get lost, get given away for various reasons, for various causes. You start going back and trying to do a genealogical research like I did on my family. And I can go back 10 generations to when they came from Europe, and I can look at where they landed at Annapolis and at Philadelphia, and I can get the documents, all of them in German, that talk about our background and our family, what the vocations were, what they had in their wills, what their possessions were at the time that they died, that had to be dispersed among the family, the marriage certificates, the birth certificates, the baptismal certificates, all those records are there. But if I try to go back beyond that to the other side of the Atlantic to find out where we're at or where we were in Germany, then I run into extra problems. First of all, the ship's manifests are missing. How many ships manifests, of all the ships that came from Europe to America 10 generations ago, how many of those manifests survive? How many of them were destroyed by fire? How many of them went down in ships? How many of them were destroyed in war? How many of them were lost? How many of them are somewhere that no one knows where they're at and they're yet waiting to be discovered somewhere in someone's archives or attic? We have no idea. Then you get to Germany and you have a major world war, World War II. And you have the destruction of huge amounts of evidence that have to do with the history of a community and the families within that community. And so we have not been able to tie back anything. And it doesn't help that our name was very common then. It was Berg, B-E-R-G. And it was that tin-eared British customs agent in Philadelphia or Annapolis who heard my ancestors say, Ich bin Johann Berg. And he listened to that guttural rolled R and the G, and he wrote down, oh, okay, B-A-R-R-I-C-K. Another one wrote it with an A-C-K. Another one wrote it with one R. Another one wrote it with a C-H. All kinds of mutilation of our name. It's lost. It's lost. It's gone. So my true name is B-E-R-G originally, but it's gone. Well, that's a very common name in parts of Germany. And so it's like, trying to find your roots with something that's common. You have a very hard time. You have to have very specific information to be able to make the tie, to make the connections. Well, think of that beyond 10 generations. Think of it going back several millennia in time and trying to identify and tie the evidence together. That's the task we're looking at. And think how much more is lost. So let's talk about the fraction that survived. How much survives? Yamauchi says, okay, let's assume that 1/10 of all of the original evidence has survived. Oh, it may not be found yet, but it still has not been destroyed. It's buried in the ground somewhere. Let's assume 1/10 has survived, and that is a very optimistic figure, okay? That's extreme. That's a hyperbole. It's exaggeration that 1/10 would survive, but let's take that. And let's say that of that which has survived, 10% of it has been surveyed. In other words, there's some record from modern archaeological research that says, okay, here at this one site, there is a tell and a former location of a settlement that dates from the Middle Bronze period on the basis of surface finds, pottery, etc. And they've actually made a survey of that, and it's been placed on the survey map. Well, only 10% of what has survived has been surveyed. And only 10% of what has been surveyed has actually been excavated. And that again is a very optimistic figure. I heard someone say here recently that only 1% or less of all the tells in Israel itself have actually been excavated. They did a survey in the Aruna Pass that we were talking about when we first started on archaeology. And they said in the Aruna Pass alone, there were 87 identifiable tells, none of which have been excavated. So 10% of that which is surveyed has been excavated. What are we down to now? If 1/10 survived, a tenth of that is surveyed, that's 1/100th. And if another tenth has been excavated, that's now down to 1/1000th of the original evidence has survived, been surveyed, and excavated. And only 10% of what has been excavated has been examined. The flood tablet that is so famous, the Babylonian flood tablet that Donald Wiseman published from the British Museum, sat in the British Museum basements for 100 years. Yes, it had survived. Yes, the site had been surveyed and excavated, and it had been found and located, transported to the British Museum, but no one had examined it until the 1950s, and had been there since the 1850s. And there's lots of evidence like that sitting in museums around the world that still has not been published, has not even been examined. People don't know what's there. They're all wrapped up in paper and put in boxes and filed away, and there's a ledger somewhere that says it's there, but no one has taken the time yet to look at it. They don't have the funds to support someone doing it, or someone doesn't have the time to do it, or the funding to take the time to do it. And then only 10% of what has been examined has actually been published. Now what are we up to? A tenth, 100th, 1,000th, a 10,000th, 1/100,000th is the fraction of the original evidence that has actually made its way to publication, and that's the hyperbolic, exaggerated, super optimistic figure. It's more like 1/10,000,000th has actually made its way to publication. So we should not be surprised at all then that there are entire areas of history, both biblically and extra-biblically, where we have tradition, where we have written evidence from a historian or someone else or writer about, and yet have no confirming physical evidence in the material realm or inscriptional realm to confirm it. It should not be a surprise at all. It's an absolute miracle that you even get one piece of evidence that ties in to the existing tradition. So like we have with the 3 pieces of evidence from 841 BC that tie in to Scripture, that is astounding. That's absolutely astounding. That's unusual. There's still a vast majority of the material in the Scriptures, and we're talking about the Old Testament, talking about historical people, individuals, events, etc., a vast majority that has nothing archaeologically to confirm it. So this is not an unusual case. It's the nature of it's the fragmentary nature of the evidence that is involved here. And once we realize that, then we see how foolish it is to allow the absence of evidence to affect our faith in what the Scripture says. Jay?
Is this due to just a shortage of skilled archaeologists, or just a shortage of funds? Or?
It's due to, the question is this due to a shortage of skilled archaeologists, a shortage of funds? What is this fragmentary amount that makes it to publication? What's that due to? It's due to a large number of factors. It's the factor of the huge amount of surviving material that is out there. It's a huge task. If we were to excavate every single tell within the borders of Israel itself, that's an astronomical task, number one. Number two, even the tells that have been excavated, most of them have not been completely excavated. I mean, a tell like Megiddo that had the financing of the Rockefellers behind it got pretty completely excavated and reported and published. But that's an unusual story. A lot of tells end up having a trench dug through them and a preliminary report given, and that's about it. They didn't find anything really spectacular, so they move on somewhere else. Because what happens is the nature of things, those who are sponsors of archaeological digs do it because they want to see results. And if you don't have results, you move on. And you go somewhere else. Let's keep looking. The excavations in Egypt looking for more tombs like King Tut's with all the gold in it. Well, that's, there's been a long time since anything like Tut's been found. Nothing before it, nothing since, like King Tut's tomb. But everyone dreams of that. And sponsors get excited about that potential, but they don't get excited about, well, there's just a bunch of stones here and a possible tie to something in the book of Judges, but, it's nothing great, so they're not going to get excited about it. So there's that issue. It's money, it's time. It's not an absence, I think, of skilled archaeologists. We've got plenty of people, plenty of scholars, plenty of students, teachers, professors, museum curators, historians, people like that are willing to do those things, but how are they going to live in the meantime? So it comes back to funding again. It also comes back to politics. It comes back to the nature of the time, the unrest in Israel, the current rise of the Hamas to power in Palestine, creating a greater tension and greater instability in the region. So there are fewer people willing to go, fewer people willing to take the risk, and fewer donors and sponsors willing to put their money into it with those high of a risk. What if someone gets killed or injured by a suicide bomber? Then you have all the insurance and all the responsibilities and everything, all the red tape you go through. The politics of the region are horrendous. You go into Syria. Syria has a wealth of tells and archaeological resources, but the current political state within Syria is not conducive to doing archaeological studies and research within Syria. It's a minor thing. And if anything is found that might indicate the validity of such a state as Israel ever being a people or existing in the region, they're not going to publish it. That's why the Ebla tablets aren't being published. The Syrian government takes over 22,000 of those tablets and says, no, you cannot publish this material. And they piecemeal out those that they scan and make certain that there's nothing politically inflammatory in it or dangerous to them. And they make certain that only those things that are neutral texts are going to be published. And so you have excavators, you have archaeologists, you have epigraphers, all these people like Pettinato that say, that's it then. I'm not going to stay here. Goodbye. I'm leaving. And you have others like Matthei that says, if I don't stay here and Syria ends up destroying all this evidence, who's going to be able to bear record of what's done and what's here? So you have politics. Look at Iraq. In Iraq, you had a beautiful museum filled with pieces, and what happens? Well, first of all, neither the Iraqi government nor the American nor the British government took proper care of that situation. They failed, totally. And the people of the region only saw an immediate opportunity to benefit by it. If you're a poor people and there's something there worth $100,000, what are you going to do? Of course they pillaged it. Fortunately, some of the museum curators had already taken some measures to try to protect some of the best of their pieces, but even their best measures didn't serve them well completely. So these things are what happen. It's just life. Life happens. And it makes it hard to then get all these things. It's just like going home and trying to reconstruct your childhood. What do you have left from your childhood? You may have had 4 teddy bears. You may have had a red wagon. You may have had baseball cards, like the ones my mother threw out while I was away at college, including Mickey Mantle's rookie card, now worth thousands of dollars. And wait until you're out of seminary for 30 years. What's left that shows that you've been in seminary? The seminaries I were in, the schools I've been in before, no longer exist. I have only one degree that still has an institution that still exists. And that program no longer exists in that institution. I'm orphaned, all right? And some time ago, my diplomas were all damaged in a flood. And so I have very little left. And there's just a few records at a few of the institutions or been transferred to other institutions for keeping that still prove that I did what I did and got the degrees I got, but much of the physical evidence is gone now for me personally. And some of you may have suffered fire, theft, or flood, and you know what that's like. So you lose things. That's life. That's what happens to evidence. And we just have to face that. That's what's here. So it's not a big deal. It's not a major case. It just proves again that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's just reality. Let's look at the levels of evidence. Page 64 of your syllabus, dealing with levels of evidence on 3.5. First of all, we're going to deal with the tertiary evidence. Tertiary evidence has to do with things like, say, the gate at Megiddo. The tertiary level takes the evidence and tries to categorize it by its importance and its priority in relation to the traditional evidence. And so we get something here. The tertiary level of evidence pertains to the background of the tradition, the background of, say, the life of Solomon, the works of Solomon, the rebuilding, the fortification of the city of Megiddo. So we go to Megiddo and we find what some call the Solomonic Gate. Now here again, there's a great deal of debate. Some say it's Solomonic, some say it's from the time of Hezekiah. By the way, that's Bill Schlegel with Ibex there on the right-hand side of the screen. So here we have a piece of evidence. We can put that together with other gates from the same period of time. In fact, that's the way I came up with the reconstruction of what the gate of Gaza would have been like that Samson carried off, because Gaza was the same type of city from the same period of time with the same type of gate construction proven by the archaeological excavations at Gaza, the same dimensions and everything else, that then we can look at these things and begin to pair them up and begin to identify them. It's like current excavations under Lawrence Steger at Ashkelon. They've been published partially in National Geographic. By the way, that's one of those areas where you find a whole field filled with pottery fragments that they're looking at there that were destroyed when Ashkelon was destroyed. And it looks like they brought all the pots from all the city and brought them to one central area, perhaps the city square, where the invaders looted everything out of all the pots and then smashed all the pots and left them there. And how'd you like to have that job, piecing all those back together? And this here is tertiary evidence. Why is it tertiary? It only provides background. It tells us what the city of Megiddo was like, what the type of gate was that Solomon utilized in the reconstruction of these cities and upgrading them to make them his main fortress cities, the main walled and fortress cities of that time, his chariot cities perhaps, some have argued. Cities of administration, very important in his reign. Then we go to secondary level. Secondary level evidence pertains to the foreground rather than the background. It involves something that ties directly to a biblical event or an individual, or to one in another tradition. If you're dealing with something like the Moabite stone, you're dealing with something maybe, the writings of Herodotus or of Arrian, some of these other traditions where you have writings but they're not tied directly to physical evidence and you find physical evidence. Well, here we have an example of inscriptional evidence at Lachish that has a direct tie to what is spoken of in the scripture in Jeremiah chapter 34 verse 7 and in Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 1. The tell at Lachish is a very fascinating tell. It's one that's been very well preserved. It's one of those areas where, as you look at it, you see that it has not eroded terribly, partly because of the drainage system that the ancient city had that's still in place. You come up from the parking area down in here, you come up from the trees and an area here, you come up here to one of the gate entries and walk up onto the mound. And right at this area, there's a drain that goes right out through the mound and underlies part of a street here. You come up to the Acropolis area where there's been a lot of excavation done. There's some large stone remnants there of buildings that are there. And when we were there, we then walked across the Tell and came down a trail over here on this corner back to the buses which had moved over here to pick us up. So you look at this Tell, you get a feel of it, you see what it's like, and you have to realize that it's not just the material remains here. They found inscriptional evidence. The Lachish ostraca were found here. Fragments of pottery with inked writing on them describing certain reports made by the garrison commanders or the soldiers that were there at Lachish. And this one ostracon, number 4, I think because it was the 4th one to be found and cataloged, says, "And let him know that we ourselves are watching the smoke signals from Lachish according to all the signals which my Lord gives, for we cannot see Azekah." So this is a pottery sherd that has a note on it that has been sent to Lachish, to the garrison commander there, to explain the position of another city that's in this line of cities that have this signal set up to where when they have news, one lights the flare and the next city lights the flare, all the way down to when Lachish finally gets it. And one of them in between is saying, we have to watch for Lachish because we can't see Azekah. So here's a tie to the fire signals mentioned by Jeremiah in chapter 6, verse 1, and the mention of Azekah as a contemporary Judean town at the period of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, an attack on Jerusalem in Jeremiah chapter 34, verse 7. So this is secondary level evidence. It refers to the same locations, the same event going on, the invasion of the Babylonian armies, that helps tie it in. But it's secondary to the biblical account because there's nothing here that confirms what the biblical account is talking about other than just a couple of things that are going on here. So that's why it's called secondary. Now let's go to the third level, which is actually the first level because we're going backwards, tertiary to secondary to primary. We get to the primary level of evidence, and the primary level of evidence is where we have data from the period of a biblical event, object or individual, that relates directly to that event, object, or individual. Now, some have tried to argue that the ostraca at Lachish could be taken as primary evidence since it is a direct reference to a biblical event, but it does not talk about the same event that was going on that Jeremiah describes. It's just the same general period of time, in the same general events, but it's not the specific event. All right? Jeremiah doesn't talk about this event of Azekah being unseen by another town, and it doesn't talk about Lachish being the one where the garrison commander is that's receiving the report. That event itself is not recorded in Jeremiah. It's only in the ostracon. But here, on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, dating around 841 BC, we do have an event that directly refers to an event that is highlighted in Scripture itself. The paying of tribute by either Jehu or Joram. There's some debate here, but either one, they're both listed in the Scriptures as having paid tribute to the king of Assyria at the time, would be Shalmaneser III. And in this you have him listed as son of Ahab of the house of Omri. And it's a dynastic title, and the house of Omri, Beit Omri, was the Assyrian way of referring to the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, because the house of Omri, like the house of David in the southern kingdom, was the main dynastic house. So you have a reference here on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser that would be listed as primary evidence. It says the tribute of Yah, the son of Omri, silver, gold, a golden shaplu vessel, a golden riton, golden goblets, golden beakers, tin, a staff for the king's hand, bud-shaped finials, the things I received from him. The interesting thing is that you see the king here. This is Shalmaneser with his attendants here, keeping an umbrella over him, someone else having something else nearby, and he's holding the gold shaplu vessel. The shaplu vessel is a bowl. And we can see that there. Whoops. And here I'm skipping over here to show you a little bit close up here. This is a very similar type vessel to one that was found at Ugarit, a gold bowl found there. You can see how it's carved and has the imagery in it. Now, this is not the identical bowl, all right? It's from a earlier period of time. I'm only showing it here to show you that gold was used for vessels, because there have been some who've argued gold was never used for vessels in Israel or in the ancient Near East. And they've questioned the gold shields in the house of the king of Israel. They've questioned the use of gold vessels and silver vessels, saying the people of Israel never were that wealthy. There was never a king like Solomon that was wealthy enough to have such things. And they look at it as fictitious. Well, here we have from Ugarit, from 1400 BC, which is the period of Moses, we have a king there who has a gold vessel. And that's 400 years before Solomon. And Solomon was a greater king than this king. This king is basically unknown, unremembered, and left nothing in writing behind. And where Solomon is world-renowned, and was world-renowned even at his own time. Question, James?
Yeah, as far as like in some of these inscriptions, how often is there like spelling errors, or it's not like paper where they can just like some of the text where they just
Right.
redo them. I mean, it's just a piece of stone. So does that come into play as far as sometimes interpretive problems or?
Okay, do errors on inscriptions come into play in interpretive problems? They certainly do. They certainly do. There are problems, there are mistakes made. For example, you walk into our offices over here and you see a replica of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew carved on kind of a basalt type of stone. It's got all kinds of mistakes in it. Whoever did it didn't do a really great job. But it's nice, it looks nice. All right? And basically, a lot of these monuments, like the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, it was there for display, it was there for show. And so if there was a mistake here or there, it wasn't a big deal normally to people. And yes, there were mistakes, and you can find mistakes. You can find them in the temple at Karnak. You can find them on the Tel Dan stela. You can find them in the Moabite stela. You can find them on the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, yes. And it's hard to erase a mistake if you've already chiseled it into stone, So it does occur, and you have to take it into account. You have to do textual criticism. Yes, Andy.
What's the circle of the center of the wings of the bird there? Whatever that is, an angel.
Here, that's the sun disk, winged sun disk.
So is that representing the sun god?
That's representing the sun god. It's representing the power. It's representing Ashur, the key god of the Assyrians. It was later assimilated into the Mithraic religion that was tied into the Romans, and where you get the Roman eagles coming into being. Before that, it was the god and prophet Ahura Mazda that goes all the way back into the earlier pagan religions of ancient Persia. It has quite a history. Yes?
What's in quotes here, is that included on this relief here?
Yes, the quotes is what's in the cuneiform on the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. That's what it says. Mm-hmm. And I've given that to you there on page 66 in your syllabus as well, underneath the picture. All right, let's go to another here. One of my favorite little cartoons. They haven't quite got this going. I don't think Logos has produced a 3D type thing where you can open your computer and feel like you're there and see the frogs hopping out at you when you're dealing with a plague of frogs in ancient Egypt. But, someone's going to figure that out eventually. We're going to have these holograms. They're going to be on our computer, put on the glasses and see it in 3D. And the frogs come right out at you. Let's go back to the definition of archaeology that some of you had a hard time with on quiz number 4. The definition of archaeology is the scientific study of the remains or remnants of ancient civilizations with the purpose of reconstructing the way of life, the conditions of living in ancient times. This is what it results in. The excavations at Caesarea Maritima have then been taken, all the material put together, and an artist then tries to reconstruct what the ancient city looked like. And this is his drawing, this is his representation. And some of you have been to Israel, you've been down there and you've walked along the some of the port area here. And there's a restaurant out here now in this area. And you've walked out there and you've seen it, and you've seen the fishing boats still coming in here, and you see all this other is missing now. But the undersea excavation that goes on there, let me go back here, the undersea excavation that's going on there keeps recovering more and more, and we find more and more out about this area. And by the way, when we were translating the Unger's Bible handbook in Bangladesh into Bengali, it was a 15-year-long project to translate it, because we were tied to the page forms and formats that were done for the English edition in England. And so the pictures and the pages all had to be the same and had to match. And they said, okay, you can translate and you have to fit it here, but the only way we're going to provide this for you and print it off for you is if you keep the same pages, so we can use the same basic layout of all the pages. Well, that's what took a lot of time, because you're translating from one language into another and trying to make it certain all fits and make certain the pictures are on the same page with the explanation. Oh, what a pain. But I was checking the translation one time, and I was looking at it, and we had one of the Bengali men was doing some of the translation for us as a first draft base, and he kept talking about this undersea explosion at Caesarea Maritima. And I thought, what is he talking about? An undersea explosion. Turned out he mistook exploration for explosion. And it was just an English mistake he'd made. But that type of thing happens. You have to watch out for it constantly. And another time we had Moses' rod. In Bengali, the rod is a lati. And in Bengali, a letter is chiti. So you have a lati and you have a chiti. Well, for some reason, there was a mistake made in transcription. The translation had been made correctly, that the rod, the lati of Aaron, had been placed within the Ark of the Covenant. But someone along the line had changed lati to chiti, and so we had the letter of Aaron. Talk about, the Da Vinci Code and the Judas Gospel. Hey, there for a while in our translation, we had the letter of Aaron. Talk about an unknown. Sometimes that happens just by mistakes in translation. So this is part of the whole purpose of doing archaeological study and investigation. To reconstruct what it was like to live in those times. What did the city look like? How did the people live at that time? How did they get their food? How was their government arranged? How were taxes collected? How was water brought into the city? What were their recreation activities like? What did they do for protection in a time of war? How extensive was the wall? How high was the wall? What kind of port did they have for shipping? How deep a draft of a ship could come into the port at Caesarea Maritima? What kind of goods came into that port? How long did it stand? When was it destroyed? All these things are things that are reconstructed on the basis of the archaeological evidence. When you're involved in excavation, like this one at Tel Rehob, you can dig a trench to get a quick view of what's within in the tell itself. We saw that as we talked about stratigraphic sequence. And when you begin the actual dig and trying to clear entire areas, the old-fashioned way of doing it was to leave balks or in between all the different areas. The balks are like here, this wall across here, and this one here where they're standing, and this one across here where the yellow arrows are. Those are balks. And they used to be left in place because they were the only means of getting the three-dimensional view, that you could see the layering effect within the tell and see the general association. Now, obviously, the same layer is not necessarily going to be carried across throughout the entire square, but at least give you some degree of reference. And then you can see the walls of the buildings themselves here marked in the red, that you can see how they run here. So the balks were used. Now, nowadays, we don't need that. Why? We have digital photography. We have computer imagery. We have all kinds of things that can be done to retain and maintain a full and a complete record of what is found in situ. But you still have to do the old-fashioned job of getting your fingers dirty, getting the dirt under your fingernails, and sifting things out of the debris that is recovered from these sites as you're excavating. And so if you go as a student on one of these archaeological digs, And I would recommend that if you ever have a chance that you do that. It is a great experience, one I never had. I've done excavation work here in the States, but I've never done any in Israel. And I would love to have the opportunity to do it, but just haven't. And who knows, maybe I'll be an old man getting around on a cane when I finally do it. But this is probably where they'd put me too, you know. You're a newbie out here, you're going to do it this way. So you're going to be sifting debris, back-breaking work in the hot sun, get your fingers dirty and you're watching for things. And perhaps you'll be lucky enough to find a major piece of material. This is a major artifact. Anyone recognize what this is or where it's from? It's a toilet. It's a toilet, yes, on Mount Zion in Jerusalem at the excavations. This dates back to about 600 BC and was there before the time of the Babylonian destruction. And we can learn a lot then about the sewage system, and this was evidently then the house of a nobleman. I mean, they had inside plumbing, everything else. There was running water here for the plumbing. Things that you watch for, you see all these things, all the things we take for granted in our houses today. Listen, people always had to take care of the same duties and have the same thing. They had to eat, they had to have somewhere to relieve themselves, and they had to have a place to sleep, they had to have a place of shelter, all these things, the same thing. So you start watching for this type of material. And when you expose artifacts, use all kinds of objects. Here use a little paintbrush to brush away the light debris, to get at the artifacts. You don't just pull them out of the ground. When you're on a tour in Israel, you're allowed to pick up a certain amount of pottery in certain places. Never pick it up in an active excavation. Never pick it up in an active site that is historical and set aside. But when you're out along the hillside or elsewhere, you're free to pick up things like that. But when you do the excavation, you don't just pick it up. You just pull it out of the ground. You carefully remove everything, watching that you don't lose one piece of evidence. Here's Sir Leonard Woolley at Ur doing the excavation work, and he's using a stick to try to remove the dirt from the back of this idol that he found within the royal tomb at Ur. Why is he so careful? Because this artifact had been painted and it was colored. So he had to carefully remove the soil from around it to try to maintain and preserve the pigment that was there. If he just scraped it away quickly, the pigment would disappear in the dirt and not be left on the artifact. It's painstaking work, but even one with a lordship, knighted by the queen, has to get down on his knees in the dirt to remove it with care. Another type of brush. Any idea about this piece of pottery here, just from our pottery lecture? It's a dome-type lid, isn't it? Where did that dome-type lid first appear? Persian period. Persian period. This is likely then to be a later development of that, and this is more than likely from the Hellenistic or Roman period. You have to watch what you're sifting very carefully, because you can get the little things. Here in America, you can go out here in the great American West, out in the desert there in Nevada and Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and the ant hills. And I've gone out to the ant hills and sifted the grains of sand from an ant hill to find turquoise beads from the Indians. And that's what you can do there. Same thing. These small little beads made of bone, made of gemstone, various things, can be found if you're very careful in going through every single grain that you have at a site. Notice what he's using. He's using a chopstick. Anything that'll work. A dental pick, a chopstick, a paintbrush, and he has this Roman era lamp, oil lamp, that he's discovered. Notice he's got a lot of sun. All right? At Tel Arad, the Eliashib ostraca were found in situ and photographed in situ. If you look at that photograph, you don't see the writing. And that's because initially the writing could not be seen because of all the dirt and debris, and then some of the writing was underneath. They had to turn it over. But the Eliashib ostraca parallels some of the ostraca found at Lachish in giving account of the advance of the Babylonian armies, and also make mention of the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem. James Pritchard is the fellow in the background, the green shirt. He's the author, and this gets into your final exam study guide. You have his name on your sheet. James Pritchard, who is he? Can you give a little bit about him in a short sentence? Very short sentence. I usually say keep it to 6 words or less. The author, or the compiler actually, the compiler of ancient Near Eastern texts, abbreviated as ANET. ANET. We used to call it ANET. Now today, when we ask you to do research of extra biblical records and materials and writings and do historical research, we send you to COS, Context of Scripture, edited by William Hallow. It's the updated translation of all this ancient material from Sumeria, from Babylonia, Assyria, from the Hittites, from Egypt, and from surrounding nations and peoples that have parallels in the biblical text. So the Context of Scripture, COS, we send you to COS today, all right? Not Cosby, but COS, all right? When I was in seminary, we'd tell our wives, I'm sorry, I can't spend time with you tonight. I have to spend time with Annette. And my wife would give me that murderous look like, you know, you're in trouble. But Annette was ancient Near Eastern texts, followed up by ancient Near Eastern pictures. And it was the classical work where you went to get this kind of information, to get the texts. What did the Assyrian Shalmaneser write about? What were his court records? All of these things. What's in the Amarna tablets? What do they say? What's their contents? You went to ancient Near Eastern texts. James Pritchard is best known for that. He was the one who compiled ancient Near Eastern texts. Besides the fact that you have to uncover things, you have to record everything that is found on a site. Here this lady is drawing a picture of an anchor at Caesarea Maritima in situ before it's moved, and that way they can have a full record of it. What if it breaks when they move it? Like, say, the Jacob bone box that was brought to America and broke. You know, you better have plenty of records of what it was like when you found it, especially if you're going to get insurance for it.
That looks fairly modern. Why does it just take a photograph?
That's because that some are purists. All right? Some of your professors still do not allow you to turn your papers in electronically, right? It's the same issue. It takes time for change to take place. But you're right. We now have programs on computers. You can take a digital photograph of that anchor and then feed it into a program that will produce a blueprint drawing of it. Okay? Of course, you have to have money to do that too. Here this fellow's taking very careful record of every piece of pottery that's in the baskets there. And on the right is Lawrence Steger, the fellow who is in charge of the excavations at Ashkelon. And this is the field of pottery that's found there in Ashkelon. He's right in the midst of it. And it is just a huge task to just interpret the pottery evidence at Ashkelon, ancient Ashkelon. Drawing to remind us again of what it was like to do a field report in the old days. This is very seldom done nowadays. It's still, I've got a few out there. They're working on a shoestring that do this type of thing. The others will use the digital photography and everything else to do it. But here at Gezer back in 1969, this is what the field drawing would show. The side of a balk, give the area. It says the west balk and scale of 1 to 25. And north is on the right, so south is on the left. And they've drawn everything in there to identify what was found at that particular site. Notice they've got a robber trench here where you have a disruption, a disturbance in the material. And here you have bedrock at the very bottom. So they took this down to bedrock and have identified it and drawn it in. So every detail has to be provided because every bit of this detail is going to have to be involved in interpreting your finds. If you found your find there where the robber trench is, you can't depend on it then being ancient. It would have got there when the robbers came in. And so when did the robbers come in? Did they come in during the Middle Ages? Or did they come in the 1960s? You see, all that has to be taken into account. Roland DeVoe, another man I think you may have on your list. He is the Roman Catholic priest there in the foreground with James Pritchard in the background. And they're going over the pottery finds the day at Tel Es Sadia, there in the Jordan Valley. And Roland DeVoe is the author of Ancient Israel. It's the best current work on the social institutions and religious institutions of Israel in accordance with the scriptures. If you're doing a study on marriage in the Old Testament, I suggest you go to Roland DeVoe to get your start. He has a chapter on marriage institutions. He has a description of what the Bible teaches about it in the Old Testament, and that's where you would begin. Then you go from there to then do your own exegesis of those various passages. But Roland DeVoe, his second area of expertise is Qumran. He's one of the chief publishers and excavators of materials at Qumran. He is French, therefore Ancient Israel was originally published in French. It's one of the few texts available in Francophone Africa and the Bible schools there to deal with that type of material. And if you want to go for a doctorate and work in the Judean Scroll area, deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're going to have to learn French. Because the Revue de Qumran is published in French because Roland DeVoe was the one who initiated all of that. Sir William Michael Flinders Petrie, 1853 to 1942, is the father of modern archaeology. He's the one who first decided to put together the pottery typology, the ceramic typology. He's the one you can thank for it. Sir William Michael Flinders Petrie. I talked about restoration of pottery and the job and task it is. This is the job this lady has at the Tel Aviv University Laboratories. These are early bronze cultic vessels from Megiddo. And you can see around there, they've got fragments everywhere. And it's going to be a long process. There's a lot of work to be done. Here's another view of some of the work being done. This one of the Edomite shrine at Ein Hatzeva, in trying to restore all of it. Yes, when you go to the museum, you're seeing the end results of all of this. And you're saying, well, why does it take so long to get something published that tells me about this particular type of pottery or this particular image finally being found when the pottery was found 100 years ago? Because we don't have the people to sit there patiently putting these things together to get the final figure that then can be photographed and then interpreted and then written about. That's the fragmentary nature of the evidence again. Just because we found it doesn't mean it's been fully identified, and definitely doesn't mean it hasn't been published. And sometimes it gets published and it gets lost. We have here 10 minutes left. Let me show you something. In fact, I think that's the last slide right there. So let me get rid of this one. And let me pull something up for you. You hear people talking about things, and they say things like, well, we have no evidence of a name like Ramses. Sometimes evidence comes to light and is actually published and then is totally forgotten. Totally forgotten. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, a find from Egypt from an 18th dynasty tomb from the 15th century BC, which would be the time of Moses, was published in a major work, promptly forgotten. And it wasn't until the 1970s that Gleason Archer brought attention to it in a publication of the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. Since his publication in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society in the 1970s, it has once again dropped completely underneath the radar, and everyone has ignored it. Because this is a tomb inscription that has the name of Ramses in it from the 18th dynasty. And remember, one of the arguments against the early day of the Exodus is that the cities of Pithom and Ramses could not exist because the name of Ramses would not be known then. And certainly there was no one of any stature or standing. Well, this is a tomb of a nobleman who is in the upper ranks right underneath the Pharaoh, and his name is Ramses. And that just keeps getting ignored and ignored and ignored again and again. And here you talk about things being lost and found. The search is finished. I must not label it under Ramses. I'm going to have to find it sometime for you. I'll try to find it by next week to show it to you. But it's that type of thing that just, you talk about the loss of evidence or the finding of evidence, and all of these things have to be kept in focus, that sometimes even if it's found and even if it's published, it drops down below the radar and people forget about it, and they go on talking about it as though it doesn't exist when it actually exists. All right, let's take one more thing here. Take you to Iraq. You'll remember, if you've paid attention to what's been going on in Iraq and the debate and the current trial, for example, of Saddam Hussein, that they constantly talk about how the Marsh Arab peoples were decimated by Saddam Hussein. He poisoned the waters. He removed them forcibly from their homes. He torched much of the area. Many of them fled to Iran because they had nowhere else to go. Well, this is the type of homes they lived in. This is a Sumerian seal being redrawn here by an artist to show you what it looks like. And it's from Lagash, which is in the Mesopotamian area. And this dates clear back to 3000 BC. And here is what those huts look like even today, the ones that are remaining. Most of them now are gone because they've been destroyed by Saddam Hussein and by his soldiers. Most of the people have fled to Iran. Many of them died. And they're only now just beginning the reclamation project, trying to reclaim the poisoned lands. But the heritage here, notice we talked about the stability of a heritage, a culture, and a way of living. The exact same houses. These houses are woven from living reeds. The roots of the reeds are still in the ground. And they took them and wove them into these buildings. Mud floors tamped down. The walls are rooted in the ground. And all these put together, and this is the way they've lived for at least 5,000 years. We have 5,000 years of recorded history and artifacts to demonstrate that this is the way that they built houses for those 5,000 years in the Marsh Arab area. By the way, this is the area talked about in Isaiah chapter 21 as the wilderness of the sea. It's located down in this area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it's a great and a large area. When we talk about the major sites of Sumerian Akkad, here we have Babylon up there in the north, and you can look on down through here, you can see Kish, Ur. This is the southern Ur, and it appears to be the correct one rather than a northern Ur around Haran. I hold to the southern view. A number of the different ones here. All of these have different implications for the early texts in the book of Genesis, where you have the listing of peoples, cities, and names. Susa, the ancient capital of the Persians. So that gets you into the later books like Esther. The find at Ebla. Notice the circles. Ebla has been known about. It's known as Ibla in many of the ancient Near Eastern records. And people have known about its existence for a long time. In 1914, they identified it as somewhere near the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. In 1924, they identified it as being at Mardin, over just south of the Tigris River. As late as 1953, some thought that Ibla was referring to Aleppo. And perhaps someone a little bit dyslexic there, turning the L and the P, the labials around there, liquids and labials. And many other sites identified. Here you can see the different circles, but it wasn't until the 1970s that it was finally and dogmatically located at Tel Mardik in Syria, and demonstrated by over 22,000 tablets recovered. And those tablets are amazing in themselves. Here's a site of the Tel, gives you a little bit of the structure of some of the Acropolis, some of the stonework that takes place there and has been worked on for excavation. Here's offering tables. These offering tables match what is described in the book of Ezekiel. I'll talk more about that when we come back next week because our time's almost up. I want to show you one more picture here. These are the tablets found in situ. Librarians love it because they fell from the wooden shelves when the shelves were burned in the way that they had been organized. So librarians can look back and see the exact way that the ancient tablets were organized and filed on the shelves. It's amazing. It's a wonderful thing.